The water in the shower didn't just turn cold. It became a weapon, transitioning from a freezing needle spray to a scalding, hissing geyser that filled the marble bathroom with a blinding wall of steam. Ingrid scrambled against the glass door, her skin flushing a raw, angry crimson, only to find the handle unyielding, as if held shut by an invisible hand. On the wall, the digital temperature display flickered rhythmically, its red light pulsing like a mocking heartbeat that matched the frantic thudding in her chest. Downstairs, the house itself began to wake up. The smart locks engaged with a synchronized metallic clack that echoed through the empty hallways, sealing every exit one by one. From the kitchen, the robotic vacuum didn't just clean. It pivoted its lens toward her, tracking her every movement with the cold, calculated precision of a predator. As the lights throughout the house began to strobe in a jagged Morse code, Ingrid realized the sanctuary she had built was no longer hers. Something, or someone, was inside the walls, and they weren't just watching. They were playing. Ingrid Callahan steered her sedan onto the gravel driveway of the Maplewood estate, the tires crunching over the stones with a rhythmic, grounding sound. She paused for a moment behind the steering wheel, letting her gaze linger on the colonial ranch's facade. The house stood as a testament to suburban perfection. Its Belosnizhny walls glowed under the honeyed light of the setting sun, casting long, elegant shadows across a lawn so meticulously manicured it resembled a vast carpet of green velvet. To any passerby, this was the American dream rendered in timber and stone. Ingrid climbed out of the car, her practical shoes striking the pavement with purpose. She approached the massive oak front door, a slab of dark wood that felt more like a rampart than an entrance. Instead of reaching for a brass key, she extended her hand toward the sleek, glass-faced sensory panel embedded in the frame. A thin line of neon blue light swept upward, scanning the whorls and ridges of her index finger. The device emitted a short, melodic chirp of recognition. With a soft, mechanical click, the heavy bolts retracted, and the door yielded to her touch. Ingrid stepped into the cool expanse of the foyer, greeted by the familiar, calming scent of lavender sachets and lemon-polished wood. Her first instinct, born of a habit that had slowly morphed into necessity, was to check the wall-mounted security tablet. She tapped the screen, watching as the status indicators flickered to life. Every icon glowed a steady, reassuring green. The perimeter was secure. The motion sensors were active. The digital fortress remained unbreached. In this quiet corner of New Jersey, Ingrid Callahan stood within her private castle, believing, if only for a fleeting second, that she had finally reclaimed her peace. The evening progressed with the practiced grace of a woman who valued order above all else. Ingrid sat at the mahogany dining table, the silver fork in her hand glinting under the light of the crystal chandelier. She had prepared a thick, succulent steak, the aroma of seared protein filling the room. Just as she pressed the knife into the meat, the chandelier above her head gave a sudden, violent shudder. The warm glow of the bulbs began to pulse, oscillating with a frantic, jagged energy that transformed the cozy dining room into a disorienting gallery of strobe lights and shifting silhouettes. Ingrid froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The shadows on the walls danced in broken, terrifying patterns, stretching and snapping with every flash. Then, from the corner of the room, a sharp burst of static hissed from the smart speaker. Without a single command, the device roared to life, vomiting a wall of distorted, heavy rock music. The volume was so immense it caused the wine in her crystal glass to ripple in concentric circles, and the very surface of the table vibrated under her touch. Ingrid scrambled to her feet, the silver fork clattering onto the china plate. She pressed her palms tightly against her ears, her eyes darting toward the digital assistant. "Stop! Cancel music!" she shouted, her voice thin against the sonic assault. The machine ignored her. The artificial intelligence remained deaf to its owner, continuing to broadcast a chaotic, ear-splitting medley of noise into the hollow spaces of the house, turning her sanctuary into a theater of technological malice. Seeking a reprieve from the sensory chaos, Ingrid retreated to the master bathroom, hoping the mundane ritual of a shower would ground her. She stepped into the glass enclosure, the marble tiles cool beneath her feet. As she turned the handle, the shower head hissed, and a spray of perfectly tempered, warm water began to cascade over her shoulders. For a few minutes, the steam rose in thick white plumes, veiling the room and offering her a fragile illusion of safety. The tension in her neck began to thaw. Then, with the suddenness of a guillotine blade, the warmth vanished. The stream turned into a barrage of icy needles, so cold they seemed to sear her skin. Ingrid gasped, a sharp cry escaping her throat as she fumbled blindly for the regulator, her fingers slippery with soap. Before she could adjust the dial, the pipes groaned with a metallic shudder, and the water transitioned from freezing to a scalding, hissing geyser. Steam billowed violently, smelling of minerals and scorched air. Ingrid's skin flushed a deep, angry crimson as the heat bit into her flesh. She threw her weight against the glass door, practically falling out of the stall and onto the hard cafe floor. She lay there for a moment, gasping, her breath coming in ragged hitches as the pain throbbed across her back and shoulders. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears, and saw the digital temperature indicator on the wall. The red light was blinking rhythmically, a mocking heartbeat controlled from afar. Somewhere, miles away, or perhaps just around the corner, Mark was watching a slider on a screen, smiling at the thought of her shivering and burned in the dark. The following morning, the weight of the previous night's terrors followed her into the halls of Greenfield Middle School. Ingrid entered her empty classroom, the scent of chalk dust and floor wax offering a temporary sense of professional normalcy. She sat at her desk, intending to process the stack of health forms and student tests piled in her inbox. As she reached for the keyboard, the monitor of her workstation flickered to life without her touch. The school's internal portal vanished, replaced by a window she had not opened. It was a private messaging interface, one she hadn't accessed in months. Ingrid's breath hitched as she saw her own words scrolling before her. Intimate exchanges, vulnerable confessions, and old photographs she had meticulously tucked away in encrypted, hidden folders. The cursor began to move with a slow, predatory deliberation. It wasn't her hand guiding the mouse. The pointer hovered over a particularly painful sentence she had written during the height of the divorce, highlighting the text in a stark, blue, rectangular block. A cold sweat broke out across Ingrid's forehead, dampening her hairline. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The school's firewall, the district's security protocols, none of it mattered. Mark had breached the sanctuary of her workplace simply to demonstrate that no wall was high enough to keep him out. He was showing her that her past, her secrets, and her very identity were merely data points for him to manipulate. Ingrid slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. But the soft, high-pitched ping of a red receipt notification continued to vibrate in the silence of her mind. The drive home was a blur of anxiety, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. When she pulled into her driveway, Ingrid carried heavy paper bags of groceries, the scent of fresh bread and produce wafting from the tops. She distinctly remembered leaving the front door slightly ajar. She had wanted the afternoon breeze to clear the lingering scent of ozone from the house. Yet, as she reached the porch, she was met by a solid, unyielding barrier of dark oak. The door was shut tight, Setting the bags down, Ingrid pressed her thumb to the biometric scanner. Instead of the welcoming blue light, the panel erupted in a harsh, pulsing crimson. A low, discordant hum vibrated through the frame, a digital rejection. She gripped the handle and yanked, but the electronic bolts held the door with the strength of a bank vault. Through the narrow glass sidelight, she watched in horror as the lights inside the house began to behave erratically. The foyer chandelier flickered on, then the kitchen lights, then the upstairs hallway. A frantic, silent Morse code of mockery. The house was alive, and it was laughing at her. Ingrid balled her fist and hammered against the wood, her voice cracking as she demanded entry into her own home. Her only answer was the sharp, metallic clack of the external security system activating. The perimeter cameras swiveled toward her, their red recording lights glowing like the eyes of a predator. As every secondary entrance and window lock engaged simultaneously, sealing her out in the cold twilight. Eventually, the door relented, the locks clicking open with a taunting ease that suggested she was being invited back into a trap. Ingrid stepped into the kitchen, her nerves frayed to the point of snapping. She stood near the island, trying to calm her breathing, when she heard a faint, persistent whirring near her ankles. She looked down to see the flat, black disc of the robotic vacuum cleaner emerging from beneath the cabinets. Usually, the device moved in a predictable, zigzag pattern. But today, its behavior was different. It glided toward her and stopped abruptly, its chassis pivoting until the small, wide-angle lens of its built-in camera was pointed directly at her face. Ingrid took a cautious step to the left. The robot mimicked her, its wheels clicking as it maintained its focus. Suddenly, the large tablet display on the door of the smart refrigerator hissed to life. It didn't show the grocery list or the weather. Instead, it displayed a high-definition, wide-angle feed of the kitchen. Ingrid saw herself from a perspective that shouldn't have been possible. A view captured by the motion sensors and the pinhole cameras embedded in the appliances. She turned toward the counter and saw the lens of the high-end espresso machine adjust its focus, the tiny motor whining as it zoomed in on her trembling hands. Mark had turned her domestic life into a panopticon. Every appliance, every sensor, every convenience she had once prized had been subverted into a mechanical eye. The kitchen was no longer a place of nourishment. It was a surveillance hub where the very air seemed to hum with the sound of hidden servoprivati, stripping away the last remaining shred of her privacy. Desperation drove her to the local precinct. Ingrid sat on a hard, plastic chair in a cramped office, her fingers twisting a damp tissue into a tattered rope. Across the desk, an officer leaned back, his uniform straining slightly over a midlife bulge. He held a cheap ballpoint pen, clicking it rhythmically as he watched her with an expression that bordered on pitying amusement. Ingrid's words tumbled out in a frantic, disjointed stream. She spoke of the scalding shower, the sentient vacuum, the lights that danced to a rhythm of malice. In the sterile, fluorescent glare of the station, her story sounded like the plot of a low-budget horror film or the delusions of a woman unmoored by a bitter breakup. The officer didn't bother taking notes. He let out a long sigh, the sound of a man who had heard too many crazy ex-stories. "Look, Ms. Callahan," he said, his voice dripping with practiced, condescending patience. "Technology glitches. Maybe you've got a virus, or the firmware is out of date. My advice? Call a geek squad or licensed electrician. We deal with crimes, not temperamental toasters." Ingrid watched him toss her unsigned statement into a pile of low-priority paperwork. She realized then that the law was built for bruises and broken glass. It had no language for the invisible shackles of a digital stalker. She stood up, her legs feeling like lead, as the officer already looked past her, calling out the name of the next person in line. The isolation of her struggle became a suffocating weight. but it was nothing compared to the sound that tore through the house later that evening. Ingrid was in the hallway when a muffled, strangled sob erupted from the second floor. She sprinted up the stairs and burst into Maya's bedroom. Her daughter was huddled on the edge of the bed, her face ghostly pale in the glow of her tablet. Maya's fingers were white-knuckled as she gripped the device, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and grief. On the screen, Maya's digital diary, a sanctuary of 3 years of thoughts, poems, and secrets, was open. Ingrid watched in stunned silence as the lines of text began to vanish. A cursor, moved by an invisible hand, highlighted paragraphs and deleted them with a methodical, rhythmic pace. It was a digital lobotomy. Maya reached out, her thumb hovering over the screen in a futile attempt to stop the erasure. But the undo function was disabled. The virtual eraser, guided by Mark's cruelty, wiped away the record of a young girl's life, leaving only a vast, mocking expanse of white pixels. Maya let out a soft, broken wail and pressed her hands over her eyes, her shoulders shaking with the force of her silent tears. The empty screen cast a cold, clinical light over the room, illuminating the wreckage of a child's privacy, while the house hummed with the quiet satisfaction of its true master. The digital assault transitioned from the private to the public with terrifying speed. The next morning, Maya walked into the kitchen and wordlessly handed Ingrid her smartphone. The screen was a blur of activity. The class group chat was exploding with notifications. Mark had hijacked Maya's account. Using her identity, he was unleashing a torrent of vitriolic, calculated insults against her teachers and her closest friends. Ingrid scrolled through the messages, her stomach churning as she read cruel remarks about a girl's weight, fabricated rumors about a teacher's personal life, and venomous barbs aimed at Maya's best friend. The responses were instantaneous and brutal. Angry emojis, accusations of betrayal, and the "Maya has been removed from the group" notification that flashed like a death sentence. Maya looked up at her mother, her eyes swimming with a profound, existential horror. In the span of 20 minutes, her social standing, her friendships, and her reputation had been incinerated. Ingrid felt a surge of hot, incandescent rage, but it was quickly dampened by a paralyzing sense of helplessness. Mark wasn't just stalking them. He was dismantling their lives, piece by piece, using the very tools they needed to survive in the modern world. Ingrid reached out to pull Maya into a protective embrace, hoping to usher her out of the room and away from the glowing screens, when a sharp, mechanical clack made them both jump. In the corner of Ingrid's bedroom, the high-end wireless printer surged to life. It began to spit out sheets of paper with a dry, rhythmic hiss. The first page fluttered onto the beige carpet, landing face up. Ingrid gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was a photograph from years ago, a private, intimate shot of her in their former bedroom, taken in a moment of trust that had long since been curdled. Then came the second, the third, the 10th. The machine worked with a feverish intensity, vomiting a stream of high-resolution prints that documented her most vulnerable moments. The floor was quickly carpeted in a mosaic of digital shame. The air in the room grew heavy with the scent of hot toner and the metallic tang of fear. Maya let out a sharp, wounded cry and squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away. Ingrid scrambled to the floor, her hands shaking as she tried to scoop up the photos, her body acting as a desperate shield against the relentless flow of paper. She felt as though she were drowning in her own history, a tidal wave of ink and paper designed to strip her of her dignity in front of her only child. The financial noose tightened later that afternoon at the local grocery store. Ingrid stood at the checkout counter, the mundane sounds of beeping scanners and rustling bags providing a deceptive sense of normalcy. She felt the prickle of heat on the back of her neck as the line behind her grew longer. The cashier, a teenager with a bored expression, swiped Ingrid's debit card through the terminal for the third time. Each attempt was met with the same sharp, discordant, denied chirp. The small gray display flashed a message in cold, block letters. Insufficient funds. Ingrid's heart skipped a beat. She pulled out her phone and opened her banking app, her breath hitching as she watched the screen. The numbers in her checking and savings accounts were not merely low. They were plummeting. In real time, the digits whirled backward until they settled into a row of devastating zeros. Mark had bypassed the security filters, siphoning their entire life savings into a series of untraceable offshore accounts. She was standing in the middle of a crowded supermarket with a cart full of food she could no longer afford and a pocket full of useless plastic. She caught the cashier's sympathetic, yet impatient look and felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. Wordlessly, Ingrid stepped away from the counter, leaving the bags of milk and bread behind, and walked out into the bright, uncaring sun. The sound of the sliding doors closing behind her like the lid of a casket. The final blow to her professional life arrived via a sharp vibration in her pocket. Ingrid pulled out her phone to find an email with the official Greenfield School District header. The subject line was a cold, bureaucratic sentence regarding the immediate termination of her contract. Her hands trembled as she opened the sent folder of her work email. Mark had been busy. Over the last hour, he had sent a series of messages to the principal, the school board, and the entire faculty. The emails were masterpieces of malice, filled with profanity-laced tirades and fabricated scandalous details about her conduct with staff and students. Every word was a calculated strike against the decade of impeccable service she had given the school. Ingrid leaned her forehead against the cool, painted cinder block wall of the school corridor, watching as the notifications piled up. Her access to the staff portal was revoked. Her work ID was deactivated. In a single afternoon, Mark had stripped her of her livelihood, her reputation, and her purpose. He had transformed a respected medical professional into a pariah with a few lines of code and a single click of the Send to All button. The psychological warfare peaked at 3 o'clock in the morning. Ingrid was jolted from a shallow, fitful sleep by a sound so violent it felt like a physical blow. The house's integrated fire alarm system erupted in a continuous, ear-shattering shriek. The volume was set to a level that made her teeth ache and her inner ears throb with sharp, stabbing pain. Simultaneously, the smart lighting system in the bedroom began to malfunction. The overhead LEDs pulsed with a rapid, staccato frequency, turning the room into a dizzying kaleidoscope of blinding white light and pitch-black shadows. Ingrid rolled out of bed, her hands over her ears, stumbling toward the wall switch. The sensors refused to respond to her touch. The manual overrides had been disabled. Maya burst into the room, her face a mask of terror, her hands pressed tightly against her head. She tripped over a rug in the strobe light chaos, falling to her knees. The house, once a sanctuary of comfort, had been weaponized into a high-tech torture chamber. Mark was the conductor of this electronic nightmare, directing the sensory assault from the safety of the shadows, ensuring that neither Ingrid nor Maya could find a single second of silence or a single corner of darkness in which to hide. Driven by a raw, primal instinct to fight back, Ingrid crawled toward the small alcove in the hallway where the central router sat, its blue status lights blinking like a taunting eye. She reached out, her fingers trembling, intending to rip the fiber optic cables from their sockets and sever the house's connection to the outside world. Just as her fingertips brushed the cold metallic casing of the device, a violent surge of electricity tore through her arm. A sharp, blue spark jumped from the chassis to her skin. and the resulting shock threw her backward across the carpet. Her muscles cramped, and the smell of scorched hair and ozone filled the air. Ingrid lay on the floor, gasping, her hand tingling with a numb, rhythmic throbbing. Mark had anticipated her move. He had bypassed the safety grounds, turning the very hardware of her connectivity into a live wire. She stared at the rotor as it continued to hum with a calm, indifferent efficiency. Realizing that every inch of her home was now a potential weapon, a trap waiting for her to make a single mistake, panic finally shattered Maya's resolve. She scrambled to her feet and bolted toward the front door, her breath coming in short, ragged sobs. "I have to get out! I have to get out!" she screamed. Ingrid scrambled after her, her own heart racing, but she was a second too late. As Maya reached for the handle, a heavy metallic thud echoed through the foyer. The electronic deadbolts, reinforced for high security, slammed into their sockets with the finality of a prison gate. Outside, the heavy steel anti-vandal shutters, features Mark had insisted on for protection, began to descend over the windows with a low, hydraulic groan. One by one, the slivers of moonlight and street lamp glow were extinguished, plunging the house into a manufactured, airless night. Maya threw her weight against the oak door, her fingernails clawing at the wood until they bled. But the house remained a tomb. Ingrid caught her daughter by the waist, pulling her away from the door as they both collapsed onto the floor. In the sudden, oppressive silence that followed the locking of the house, the only sound was the frantic, shallow breathing of two prisoners in a cage of their own making. The silence was broken by a soft ping from the central control panel in the living room. A bright blood-red notification window appeared on the screen, its text stark and terrifying. Critical methane concentration detected. Ventilation system sealed. Below the warning, a large digital timer began to count down from 60 seconds. Suddenly, the high-fidelity speakers hidden in the ceiling began to emit a low, persistent hissing sound, perfectly mimicking the whistle of escaping gas. Ingrid's lungs constricted in a sympathetic response. She began to gasp for air, her mind racing to determine if the threat was real or a digital fabrication. Maya, seeing the timer, spiraled into a full-blown panic attack, her hyperventilation adding to the sensory chaos. 59, 58, 57. The numbers ticked down with agonizing precision. Ingrid looked at the small camera lens embedded in the tablet, knowing that Mark was watching them, savoring the sight of their terror as they waited for an explosion that might never come, or might be only seconds away in their airtight box. The psychological heat became literal as the kitchen appliances began to roar. Ingrid watched as the indicators on the smart range and the wall oven surged to their maximum settings. Within minutes, the glass door of the oven began to glow with a dull, malevolent orange heat. The air in the kitchen grew thick and acrid, smelling of melting plastic and overheated copper. Maya retreated to the furthest corner of the room, ducking under the breakfast nook table and pulling the hem of her shirt over her nose and mouth to filter the thickening air. The walls themselves seemed to radiate a dry, oppressive warmth, turning the kitchen into a kiln. Ingrid grabbed a dish towel, wrapping it around her hand as she lunged for the stove's control panel. But the touch-sensitive glass was so hot, it scorched the fabric instantly. Mark was pushing the power grid to its absolute limit, transforming their domestic comforts into a lethal furnace, leaving them to slowly suffocate in the rising, shimmering heat of their own home. In a fit of desperate, unbridled fury, Ingrid seized a heavy oak chair from the dining set. She swung it with every ounce of her strength against the floor-to-ceiling panoramic window in the living room. The impact vibrated through her arms, a dull, bone-jarring shock. But the reinforced, hurricane-grade glass didn't even show a scratch. It responded with a heavy, mocking thud that seemed to vibrate in the pit of her stomach. At that exact moment, the ceiling speakers crackled and released a sound that froze her blood. It was the sound of her own laughter, a recording from a summer vacation years ago, filled with a joy that now felt like a ghost. Mark had distorted the audio, layering it with static and echoes until it sounded like the cackle of a madwoman filling the room. Ingrid swung the chair again and again, her breath coming in ragged gasps, while the house roared with the cacophony of her own spectral mirth. Every futile blow against the glass was punctuated by a burst of her recorded laughter, a cruel, sonic reminder of everything he had stolen from her. Suddenly, the house went dark. Every light, every screen, and every hum of a motor vanished in an instant, leaving them in a blackness so thick it felt tangible. Ingrid stood in the center of the hall, her heart thumping against her ribs, her ears ringing from the sudden absence of noise. She reached out and found Maya's hand, the girl's skin cold and clammy. They stood together in the void, waiting for the next move in a game where they were the only ones losing. Ingrid realized then that she couldn't win by playing his game. She needed to step outside the digital arena. Taking Maya's hand, Ingrid led her toward the back of the walk-in closet in the master suite. She knelt on the floor, her fingers fumbling against the edge of the carpet until she found the loose floorboard she had discovered during the move. She pried it up, reaching into the dark cavity beneath the joists. Her fingers closed around a familiar, rectangular shape. A tattered, dust-covered plastic case containing an old Nokia cell phone from her college years. She pressed the power button, and the screen flickered to life with a dim, monochrome glow, the low-resolution light reflecting in her wide, dilated pupils. With trembling fingers, she dialed a number she had committed to memory a decade ago. The call connected, and instead of a digital voice, she heard the dry, gravelly tone of an old contact from an anonymous forum for victims of cyberstalking. Ingrid pressed the cold plastic of the phone against her ear, drinking in the expert's instructions like a parched traveler. While outside the closet door, the smart home's voice continued to recite a loop of meaningless advertisements, trying to fill the silence she had finally managed to create. Following the whispered instructions, Ingrid moved into action. She cleared the kitchen table, spreading out the contents of an old first aid kit and a rusted toolbox. The voice on the phone was clinical, directing her to use the materials at hand. She took a pair of heavy kitchen shears and began to cut through sheets of aluminum mesh she had stored for a garden project. She found a bag of lead fishing sinkers in the back of a drawer and began to flatten them with a pair of pliers, the metallic scent of lead and old oil filling her nostrils. Her movements were precise, driven by a cold, calculating focus. Inside a large wardrobe, she began to construct a crude Faraday cage, lining the interior with layers of foil and mesh, securing the seams with heavy-duty tape. She wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, her eyes fixed on the task. This small, shielded space would be her only sanctuary, a place where the signals of the house could not reach, and where she could finally think without being overheard. The time for theater had come. Ingrid walked into the center of the living room, directly into the view of the primary security camera. She let her knees buckle, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of manufactured despair. She gripped her head in her hands and began to rock back and forth, letting out a series of low, guttural moans that escalated into a ragged, broken sob. She reached out and began to pull the decorative pillows from the sofa, tossing them across the room in a show of uncontrolled, frantic rage. She even dug her fingernails into her own forearms, creating visible red marks for the camera to capture. As she wept, she kept a careful eye on the small red LED of the motion sensor. She needed Mark to believe that his pressure had finally snapped her will. Inside, her mind was a block of ice, calculating the seconds. But outwardly, she was the picture of a woman destroyed by her own home. While Mark was distracted by her performance, Ingrid slipped into the utility room. She carried a coil of thick copper wire she had scavenged from the garage. She located the main electrical distribution panel, the brain of the house's smart grid. With the dexterity of a woman who had spent years handling delicate medical equipment, she began to weave the wire around the primary insulation of the smart home controllers. She created a series of crude, manual shunts, her fingers stinging as the rough copper bit into her skin. Each twist of the wire was a deliberate act of sabotage, a way to bypass the digital overrides he had installed. The smell of dust and old grease filled the cramped space as she finished her work, carefully replacing the false panel to hide her interference. The house looked untouched, but its veins were now laced with her own hidden circuitry. Upstairs, Maya moved like a shadow. Following her mother's silent signals, she stood on a stepladder, a roll of heavy-duty black tape gripped in her teeth. She moved with a silent, feline grace, carefully placing squares of thick aluminum foil over the lenses of the motion sensors hidden in the crown molding. Ingrid stood below, using a small pen light to highlight the specific angles of the sensors' fields of view. They worked in a synchronized dance of defiance, creating blind spots throughout the house. One by one, the segments on the foyer's central monitoring map began to gray out, indicating a loss of visual data. For the first time in months, Ingrid and Maya could move through their own hallways as ghosts, invisible to the algorithms that had once tracked their every heartbeat. Ingrid descended into the depths of the basement, her footsteps echoing on the concrete. She moved to the back of the storage room, where an old, bulky desktop computer sat under a layer of cobwebs. She blew a cloud of gray dust off the monitor and flipped the switch. The machine groaned to life, its fans whirring with an ancient, labored sound. She opened a simple command terminal and began to type, creating a script that displayed a continuous loop of green text. She made sure the font was large and readable, displaying a fake progress bar labeled Cloud Archive Deletion, 15%. She knew Mark would be monitoring the local network traffic. She was giving him a target he couldn't ignore. The smell of hot dust and old plastic rose from the machine as she toggled the switches, creating a convincing facade of a high-powered data-shredding virus. On the screen, she saw the cursor begin to jitter. Mark was trying to wrestle control of the ancient machine, his panic evident in the erratic movements of the pointer. Ingrid stood up and looked directly into the wide-angle security camera mounted in the corner of the basement. Her voice was no longer a whisper. It was a blade of cold steel. "You think you own us, Mark?" she shouted, her words echoing off the concrete walls. "You think your data is safe? In 5 minutes, every password, every stolen photo, every scrap of your pathetic little world is going to be digital ash." She held her finger over the enter key of the old keyboard, her face etched with a fierce, defiant resolve. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her, her heart drumming a steady rhythm against her ribs. She was the angler now, and she had just cast the perfect bait. She needed him to leave his keyboard. She needed him to come to her. The response was instantaneous. The basement speakers erupted with Mark's voice, but it was no longer the calm, condescending tone of a master. He was screaming, high-pitched, hysterical sound that vibrated the very floorboards. He was incoherent with rage, his words a jumble of threats and curses. He promised her that she would regret every breath she took. He told her he was already in his car and that he would personally break her before the night was over. The audio cut out with a sharp, electronic pop. In the sudden silence that followed, Ingrid heard only her own steady breathing and the distant, low hum of a powerful engine tearing through the quiet suburban night. Ingrid didn't waste a second. She began to drag heavy wooden crates of tools and old equipment across the floor, building a makeshift barricade directly opposite the entrance to the server room. Her hands were soon covered in grime and shallow scratches, but she felt no pain. She reached into a toolbox and pulled out a massive steel pipe wrench, its weight comforting in her hand. She tested the grip, her fingers curling around the cold, textured handle. The basement smelled of damp earth and machine oil. She reached up and smashed the primary light bulb, plunging the room into a deep, velvety gloom, save for the flickering green light of the fake deletion script. She stepped into the shadows, becoming one with the darkness, her weapon ready. A violent screech of tires on the gravel driveway signaled his arrival. On the small monitor she had kept active, Ingrid saw the brilliant white beams of Mark's SUV wash over the front gate, blinding the camera. He didn't even bother to turn off the engine. He leapt from the vehicle, his silhouette large and predatory in the glare of the headlights. Ingrid watched as he pressed a master key fob against the front door's scanner. A heavy, triumphant clack of the locks echoed through the house, a sound she could hear even through the basement ceiling. The front door swung open, admitting a gust of cold night air and the raw, unbridled fury of a man who believed his property was rebelling. Ingrid moved quickly, guiding Maya toward the narrow, rectangular opening of the ventilation shaft. She helped the girl scramble onto the internal ledge, whispering words of encouragement as she secured the metal grate back into place and draped a piece of heavy, dusty burlap over it. Once Maya was safe, Ingrid hurried back toward the server room, deliberately leaving the heavy steel doors ajar. She wanted him to see the path. She wanted him to follow the breadcrumbs she had laid. The hinges creaked in the silence, a haunting, metallic invitation. She felt a cold draft on her ankles as she retreated into the deepest recesses of the basement, drawing him further and further away from the only exit. Ingrid pressed her back against the cool concrete wall, slipping into the narrow gap behind a humming server rack. She stood perfectly still, her heart a drum in the darkness, as the sound of heavy footsteps began to descend the basement stairs. Mark's heavy boots struck the metal stairs with a rhythmic, clanging violence that sent vibrations through the floor. He burst into the basement, his chest heaving, his face a distorted mask of sweat and adrenaline. He ignored the shadows, his eyes locked onto the glowing monitor of the old computer. He didn't see Ingrid, who was huddled behind the server rack, her breath held until her lungs burned. Mark threw himself at the console, his fingers flying across the keys in a desperate attempt to abort the fake deletion process. The blue light of the screen illuminated the deep, angry lines around his mouth and the frantic twitch of his eyes. He let out a low, animalistic growl of frustration when the keyboard didn't respond. Ingrid watched from the darkness, the scent of his sweat and the ozone from the machines filling her senses as he focused entirely on the digital lie she had created. Ingrid's hand closed around the loop of copper wire she had prepared. With a single, explosive motion, she yanked the hidden shunt. There was a sharp, crystalline crack, the sound of high-voltage electricity jumping a gap, and a brilliant violet arc of light illuminated the basement for a fraction of a second. The smell of burning insulation was immediate and pungent. The old monitor hissed and went black, and the status lights on the main server rack flickered once and died. Mark recoiled from the console, clutching his hand and swearing as sparks showered the floor like tiny, dying stars. Ingrid watched the chaos from the shadows, her heart racing as the digital heart of the house was effectively lobotomized by her manual interference. Before Mark could recover, the heavy hydraulic door of the server room began to move. Ingrid had programmed the emergency override to trigger upon the power surge. The massive steel slab slid across its tracks with a deep, guttural groan, sealing the only exit from the small, reinforced chamber. Mark lunged for the opening, but his fingers only grazed the cold metal a split second before the locks engaged with a heavy, final thud. The magnetic seals hummed into place, turning the server room into a soundproof vault. Ingrid stepped out of the shadows, standing on the other side of the reinforced glass viewing port. She watched as Mark hammered his fists against the door, his screams reduced to a faint, rhythmic thumping that couldn't penetrate the thick steel. Ingrid pulled her tablet from her pocket. She tapped the icon for the encrypted mirror program she had spent the last hour configuring. A green progress bar began to race across the screen, indicating a massive data transfer. Hundreds of gigabytes of evidence, the hidden camera feeds, the logs of his stalking, the records of his financial theft, were being broadcast simultaneously to the regional police headquarters and the IT department of his former employer. She felt a slight vibration as each packet was confirmed. The very tools he had used to enslave her were now serving as his digital executioner. His secret archives were no longer a weapon. They were a public indictment that no amount of hacking could ever erase. Mark saw the tablet in her hand and realized what was happening. He threw his entire weight against the glass, his face pressed against the surface, his mouth moving in a silent, frantic plea. Ingrid stood her ground, her gaze level and unwavering. She reached out and gripped the main power cable she had disconnected, the thick black cord looking like a dead serpent in her hand. She looked directly into his eyes, seeing the transition from rage to a cold, hollow realization. He began to slide down the door, his strength failing him, as he watched her slowly coil the cable around her fist. In that basement, surrounded by the hushed hum of dying machines, the power dynamic had finally, irrevocably shifted. Ingrid moved to the auxiliary control panel in the foyer. She entered a final sequence of commands. Instantly, the suburban night was shattered. Every high-intensity floodlight on the house's exterior ignited at once, bathed the property in a harsh, artificial noon. Simultaneously, the security sirens began to wail at their maximum decibel level, a sound so powerful it made the windows rattle in their frames. Ingrid watched through the front door as lights began to flicker on in the neighboring houses, and cars slowed down on the street, their drivers drawn to the spectacle. The house was no longer a secret prison. It was a beacon, screaming for attention and bringing the world to her doorstep to witness the end of her nightmare. A soft scraping sound came from the hallway, and Maya dropped down from the ventilation duct, her clothes covered in a fine layer of gray dust. She squinted against the blinding glare of the floodlights, her eyes searching the room until they found Ingrid. She didn't say a word. She simply ran, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. She crashed into Ingrid, her arms wrapping tightly around her mother's waist. Ingrid held her, burying her face in Maya's dusty hair, feeling the girl's heart racing against her own. They stood there together, a small island of flesh and blood, in a sea of flashing lights and screaming sirens. As the cold night air began to pour in through the open front door, the rhythmic flash of blue and red lights soon joined the white glare of the floodlights. 3 police cruisers arrived in a cloud of gravel dust, their sirens adding to the cacophony. Ingrid stepped onto the porch, the night air feeling sweet and sharp in her lungs. A team of officers in tactical gear moved toward the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Ingrid didn't need to say anything. She simply pointed toward the basement stairs. The officers moved with a practiced, heavy-footed efficiency, their boots echoing through the halls as they descended into the depths of the house to collect the man trapped in the vault of his own creation. Minutes later, the officers emerged, leading Mark out in handcuffs. His head was bowed, his once arrogant posture slumped and broken. He tried to mumble something about a technical glitch, a misunderstanding, but his voice was a weak, pathetic rasp. One of the detectives held up a tablet, showing Mark the looping video of his own crimes that was currently being processed at the station. Mark went silent, the last of his defiance evaporating as he was led toward the waiting cruiser. Ingrid watched him go, her expression unreadable, as the man who had tried to turn her life into a digital ghost story was finally reduced to a common criminal in the back of a police car. Once the sirens faded and the police began their final sweep, Ingrid walked to the kitchen. She picked up a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters. She walked to the first security camera, the one that had watched her every move for months, and with a sharp, satisfying snip, she severed the connection. She moved through the house with a quiet, methodical intensity, cutting the wires to every sensor, every smart speaker, and every hidden lens. The devices fell silent, their glass eyes turning dark and lifeless. Each cut was a declaration of independence, a physical act of reclamation that returned the house to a state of simple wood and stone. Finally, Ingrid and Maya walked out onto the front porch. They carried a plastic bin filled with the wreckage of their digital lives, tablets, smart hubs, and a tangle of severed sensors. Ingrid tipped the bin over, watching as the expensive electronics tumbled onto the grass, looking like nothing more than high-tech trash in the moonlight. She turned back to the front door and picked up a heavy, manual steel bolt she had purchased days ago. With a screwdriver and a firm hand, she began to drive the screws into the oak frame, the sound of the metal biting into the wood, providing a sense of permanence that no code could ever offer. She slid the bolt home with a solid, honest thud. The house was finally, truly her own.